In the quiet village of Kejoni, where the earth was always red after dawn and the baobab tree stood like ancient guardians, Oman Lovu woke before sunrise to the sound of coughing. Her husband, Jebulani, had been sick for months, but that morning, the silence between each breath was longer than before. Amma sat beside him on their straw mat, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead while their 5-year-old son, Kito, slept curled in the corner beneath a patched blanket. The first golden line of sunlight entered through the cracked mud wall just as Jebulani took his final breath. Amma did not scream. She only froze, her hand still against his face, as if love alone could pull him back into the world. Outside, the village roosters announced a new day, cruelly unaware that hers had ended. Before noon, the women of the village gathered around her hut, singing low morning songs while men prepared the burial ground near the acacia grove. Amma sat with empty eyes, but when Kito asked, "When will Boba wake up?" her heart split into pieces she knew would never fully mend. That same day, she understood a truth harsher than grief. In a village where widows were pitied but rarely helped, survival would now depend on her alone. She had no land title, no savings, no brothers nearby, and no promise from the future. All she had was a child with bright eyes and a life that had suddenly become heavier than her own. And before sunset, as the last handful of soil fell over her husband's grave, Amma made a vow in silence: her son would never feel the full weight of this loss, even if she had to carry it all herself. A week after the funeral, hunger arrived like an uninvited relative that refused to leave. The millet jar was nearly empty, the charcoal sack held only dust, and the village shopkeeper had already begun speaking to Amma with the careful politeness reserved for people who could no longer pay. She owned only one thing of real value now, a strong white goat Jebulani had raised since it was a kid. It was supposed to be their emergency hope, the animal they would breed, sell, and rebuild from. But emergencies never ask permission. Amma tied a rope around the goat's neck and walked it to the market under the burning afternoon sun, while Kito skipped beside her, unaware of the grief wrapped inside that journey. At the market, the traders circled her like hawks, sensing desperation. One man offered half its worth. Another laughed and said widows should be grateful for anything. Amma swallowed her pride, bargained with steady eyes, and sold the goat for less than it deserved but more than she feared. With the money, she bought maize flour, beans, cooking oil, and a pair of second-hand school sandals for Kito, whose feet were already pressing through the soles of his old pair. That night, she cooked a proper meal for the first time in days. Kito ate with both hands and smiled so brightly that the loss of the goat felt, for a moment, almost worthwhile. But after he fell asleep, Amma sat outside under the stars and stared at the empty post where the goat had once been tied. It was not just an animal she had sold. It was security. It was pride. It was a piece of the future she had once imagined with her husband. Still, as she looked back through the doorway and saw Kito sleeping with a full stomach and new sandals beside him, she whispered into the dark, "I will sell everything before I let life sell his dreams." The nearest school was 7 kilometers away, past dry riverbeds, thorn bushes, cassava fields, and a narrow road where bicycles and overloaded buses passed like storms. Every morning, Amma woke Kito before the birds, heated water over charcoal, washed his face, and dressed him in the cleanest shirt she could manage. When he first complained about the distance, she smiled and turned the journey into adventure. She pointed to cloud shapes and called them kings. She turned bird calls into riddles. She used pebbles to teach him counting long before he saw a classroom chalkboard. By the time they reached school, Kito was laughing, and no one could tell that his mother's feet were bleeding inside worn sandals. The teachers noticed that Kito learned fast. He remembered every lesson, wrote neatly, and listened as if words themselves were treasure. Amma listened too, not from a desk but from outside the classroom window when she could, pretending to sweep the yard while memorizing what she never had the chance to learn. At times, when rain flooded the path and the other children stayed home, she carried Kito on her back across the muddy sections so his books would not get wet. When the sun was merciless, she gave him the shade side of the road and walked in the heat herself. To everyone else, it looked like motherhood. But in Omar's heart, it was war, a daily battle against poverty, against chance, against the idea that some children are born too far from opportunity to ever reach it. One evening, Kito asked her why she never missed a day. Omar looked at the horizon, glowing orange above the plains, and answered, because education is the only road no one can steal from you once you walk it. Kito did not fully understand then. But those words sank into him like rain into thirsty ground, becoming the first foundation stone of the man he would one day become. Image prompt. When daylight ended, Omar's labor did not. After working in other people's fields for coins and leftover vegetables, she returned home, cooked, cleaned, helped Kito revise his lessons, and then began her night work. By kerosene lamp, she repaired torn clothes for neighbors, stitched school uniforms, and wove baskets from dried palm strips until her fingers cramped and her eyes watered. Some nights she fell asleep sitting up, needle still in hand. Other nights she hummed old lullabies to keep herself awake. Kito would sometimes rise in the darkness and find her still walking, the lamp turning her shadow into something taller than the hut itself. On festival days, when other women wore bracelets and bright head wraps, Omar wore simplicity. She stopped buying anything for herself, no sugar for tea, no new dress for church, no jewelry, no comfort she could postpone. Each coin had a destination: exercise books, exam fees, pencils, medicine, soap, uniforms, transport when needed. She began keeping those coins in a rusted tin hidden beneath a woven mat. To Kito, it was only a box. To Omar, it was a treasure built from exhaustion. She called it the future box. One rainy season night, thunder shook the hut while Omar stitched a torn blazer someone had promised to pay for at month's end. Kito watched her from bed and asked softly, "Mama, don't you ever get tired?" She smiled without looking up. "I do," she said. "But dreams get tired too if no one carries them." That answer stayed in the room long after the storm passed. It floated above the lamp, above the needle, above the silent truth that Omar had begun to disappear inside sacrifice, not because anyone forced her to, but because love had convinced her that vanishing was a fair price for her son's tomorrow. At the edge of Kejoni stood a giant baobab tree where villagers met to settle disputes, tell stories, and rest during harvest season. Omar often took Kito there at dusk after long days, because it was the only place where the air felt large enough to hold her hopes. One evening, after his teacher praised him for ranking first in class, Kito ran circles around the tree, laughing, while Omar sat against its trunk and watched with tears she would never let him see. She imagined him in a city one day, wearing polished shoes, speaking with confidence, stepping into buildings where men in suits made decisions that shaped nations. She had never seen such places herself, yet she believed in them with fierce certainty because she believed in him. When Kito came and sat beside her, sweaty and happy, Omar held his small hands inside her rough ones and said, "Listen to me carefully. One day you will leave this village. You will see roads wider than fields and lights brighter than stars. People will know your name. But promise me one thing, do not become too important to remember where your feet first learned to walk." Kito nodded eagerly, like children do when promises still feel simple. He pressed his head against her shoulder and said, "I will always come back for you, Mama. I will build you the biggest house in Kejoni." Omar smiled, but deep inside, she knew life had a cruel way of changing vows made in innocence. Even so, she chose faith over fear. Beneath the baobab, with evening wind moving through the branches like quiet applause, she kissed his forehead and trusted the future she had not yet met. When Kito turned 12, news spread that a prestigious boarding school in the district capital was offering one scholarship place to the top rural student. The exam would be difficult, the competition fierce, and the fee for registration was more than Omar usually earned in 2 weeks. Still, when Kito's teacher came to their hut and said, "This boy should try," Omar did not hesitate. She opened the future box, counted the coins carefully, and realized it was not enough. The next morning she took on extra work at the riverbank, washing laundry for wealthier families until her back ached and her hands wrinkled raw. At night she still sewed. By the third week, she had the fee. Preparing keto became her mission. She borrowed old textbooks from a retired teacher, copied pages by hand when she could not borrow them long enough, and turned every evening into a lesson. Fractions were taught with cassava slices. Geography was taught through journeys imagined in the dirt with sticks. History became stories told while grinding maize. Keto studied until sleep pulled his head forward, and Omar would gently lift it, urging him to finish one more page. She was not only raising a boy anymore. She was shaping an answer to every humiliation poverty had ever thrown at her. On the morning of the exam, Omar ironed Keto's shirt with a charcoal iron borrowed from a neighbor. It burned one sleeve slightly, and she nearly cried, but Keto only laughed and said no one would notice. They traveled to the district town in the back of a crowded lorry full of sacks, chickens, and nervous children. Before he entered the exam hall, Omar placed both hands on his shoulders and said, "Do not be afraid of children who look richer than you. Paper cannot read wealth. It only reads truth." Keto smiled and walked in. Omar remained outside under the sun for hours, praying, waiting, believing. Before the scholarship results came, drought struck Kejoni with merciless precision. Clouds gathered but gave no rain. The maize stalks turned pale, then brittle. Cracks opened in the fields like wounds. Goats grew thin, water lines at the well lengthened, and even laughter in the village became quieter. Amma had planted a small patch of maize on borrowed land, hoping to sell part of the harvest and keep the household stable. Instead, she watched the field crumble into dust beneath a white, pitiless sky. For the first time in years, fear entered her thoughts not as a passing shadow but as a resident. Food became measured in handfuls. Oma started pretending she had already eaten so Keto would take the larger portion. When he offered her half his plate, she smiled and said mothers do not get hungry like children do. It was a lie repeated so often it became almost sacred. Some evenings she drank water and slept early to quiet the pain in her stomach. Yet she never allowed Keto to miss school, and never let him sense how near desperation truly was. To preserve his concentration, she turned hardship into discipline. "This is a season," she told him. "Seasons pass. Character remains." Then, one afternoon, a letter finally came from the district capital. Omar's hands shook so badly she could not open it herself. The teacher read it aloud. Keto had won the scholarship. The village erupted in celebration. Women ululated. Children danced. Even those who had once doubted Omar's stubborn devotion now praised her faith. But when the celebration ended, a second truth emerged: the scholarship covered tuition, not uniforms, bedding, trunk, travel, and countless hidden costs. Victory had opened the gate, but the road ahead still demanded payment. Among Omar's few treasured possessions was a brass bracelet engraved with tiny geometric markings, given to her by her own mother on the day she married. It was the only item she owned that carried beauty without utility. She had worn it during childbirth, during mourning, during harvest festivals, during lonely nights when memory was all she had. On the evening she sat calculating the cost of Keto's boarding school needs, she touched the bracelet and understood what must happen. The next morning, she removed it from her wrist, wrapped it in cloth, and walked to the trading center. The jeweler looked at the bracelet with detached greed. To him, it was metal. To Omar, it was lineage, blessing, and the final surviving bridge to the woman who had once taught her how to endure. She nearly turned back twice before entering the shop. But then she pictured Keto in that school, surrounded by libraries, laboratories, and teachers who could open words neither she nor her husband had ever seen. She placed the bracelet on the counter and said, "How much?" The amount offered was insultingly low. Omar negotiated with a firmness sharpened by necessity, and though she still got less than its emotional value, she left with enough money to buy a mattress roll, uniform fabric, a metal trunk, socks, soap, and the bus fare to the city. That night, while packing Kito's things, she kept touching the empty skin on her wrist, feeling strangely exposed. Kito noticed and asked where the bracelet had gone. Omar smiled and said, "I exchanged it for something more useful." He looked at the neatly folded uniform and polished shoes and did not ask again. Years later, he would remember the missing bracelet and realize it had not been exchanged for usefulness. It had been exchanged for him. The day Kito left for boarding school, Kejoni felt too small to contain Omar's pride and too fragile to survive her loneliness. Villagers gathered at the dusty bus stop, carrying blessings, roasted peanuts, and advice. Omar had washed Kito's clothes twice, polished his shoes until they reflected light, and packed his trunk so neatly that every shirt looked like a promise. When the bus arrived in a storm of dust and diesel smell, Kito's excitement burst through him like sunlight. He had never traveled that far before. He hugged neighbors, grinned at the conductor, and stared at the bus windows as if they were doors to another universe. Omar held herself together until the final minute. Then she pulled him aside and adjusted his collar one last time. "Listen," she said, her voice low and fierce. "In that city, do not be ashamed of your village. Do not hide your accent. Learn everything, respect everyone, and remember that humility travels further than pride." Kito nodded, though his eyes were already full of the future. When the conductor called for passengers, he climbed aboard, waved, and found a seat by the window. Omar waved back with a smile so steady it almost looked easy. But the moment the bus vanished beyond the bend, the strength went out of her knees. The road stood empty, the dust settling slowly like the end of an era. She walked home alone, carrying no trunk, no hand to hold, no chatter beside her. Inside the hut, his sleeping mat lay rolled in the corner. His cup sat untouched. The silence was so complete it felt like a second widowhood. Yet even in that ache, Omar whispered, "Go far, my son. Just don't go so far that love cannot find you." At boarding school, Kito entered a world of polished corridors, English-speaking prefects, science laboratories, and classmates who arrived with suitcases fuller than anything he had ever owned. At first he felt small, but letters from Omar kept him grounded. She wrote slowly because writing was still difficult for her, yet each letter carried a force beyond grammar. She asked about his classes, reminded him to pray, and described village life in little details: the neighbor's new baby goat, the first rain after drought, the baobab still standing strong. Sometimes she enclosed a pressed leaf or a tiny woven bookmark. Her letters were never fancy, but they were full of home. Kito wrote back often in the beginning. He told her about mathematics competitions, a teacher who liked him, and a library bigger than the church in Kejoni. Omar read every letter until the paper softened from handling. When loneliness became sharp, she unfolded them and felt less abandoned. Through those exchanges, mother and son remained stitched together across distance. Each envelope was a bridge. Months turned to years. Kito's letters became shorter as his life expanded. Omar excused it at first. "He is busy," she told herself. "Success is demanding." Yet even before anything truly changed, a faint shadow had begun to form, the quiet distance that grows not from cruelty at first, but from new words replacing old ones. Omar sensed it, but chose hope. She always chose hope. By the time Kito reached university in the capital city of Lamora, he had become exactly what Omar had dreamed of: intelligent, articulate, ambitious, and impossible to ignore. He won debate contests, earned top grades in economics, and learned to navigate rooms filled with people whose confidence had been inherited rather than earned. In Lamora, reinvention was easy and often rewarded. Kito shortened the pauses in his village accent, bought second-hand blazers that looked expensive from a distance, and studied not only textbooks but mannerisms, how to shake hands firmly, how to laugh lightly at formal dinners, how to sound like he belonged among future ministers and executives. People admired his story when it was told in polished summary, "Rural boy rises through merit." It sounded noble at events and interviews. But the real story, the hunger, the sold goat, the missing bracelet, the bleeding feet of a mother who walked him to school, became less convenient in the version he shared. He still loved Omar, or believed he did, but love began drifting into sentiment while shame quietly entered the room. Not shame of her heart, but of her simplicity. Of her grammar. Of her clothes. Of the village dust he could never completely wash from his origin. Omar, meanwhile, followed his progress through letters read aloud by the teacher, rare phone calls made from the market kiosk, and rumors carried back by travelers. Every success of his made her walk taller. When neighbors said, "Your son will become someone important," she smiled as if God himself had answered her years of sleepless labor. She did not know that in the city, importance was beginning to ask Kito for a dangerous trade, advance, but leave evidence of where you came from behind. The first year Kito failed to return home for harvest season, Omar defended him before anyone could even question it. "Exams," she said. "Important internships. He is building his future." She prepared his favorite groundnut stew anyway, dried fish the way he liked it, and set aside stories to tell him under the baobab. She even washed the curtain at the hot entrance and patched the roof corner above his sleeping area. But he did not come. A message arrived instead through the shopkeeper's phone, "Sorry mama, too much work. Next time, I promise." Omar read and reread the short message as though meaning might deepen with repetition. She told herself not to be selfish. Had she not sacrificed precisely so he could live a larger life? Did she want him trapped by village obligations after all this struggle? Yet when night came and the meal she had prepared stayed untouched, she felt something heavier than disappointment. It was the first small bruise of being left behind by the dream she had created. Kito truly intended no cruelty. In the city, every Miss Boss, every networking dinner, every exam, every internship felt like a decisive step in a narrow race. He kept saying next time because he believed there would always be time later to make things right. That is how forgetting often begins, not with hatred, but with postponement so casual it disguises itself as practicality. While Omar sat beneath stars in Kijoni telling herself to be patient, Kito attended rooftop gatherings in Lomora where music paused late into the night and people spoke of future deals, ministries, and international opportunities. The distance between village and city was no longer measured in kilometers. It was measured in what each of them had started expecting from life. In his final year at university, Kito met Zoe Boko, the daughter of a powerful business family. She was elegant, brilliant, and raised in privilege so complete that inconvenience itself seemed foreign to her. She admired Kito's intelligence, his discipline, and the polished version of his struggle. To her friends, he was impressive because he had made himself. Kito loved how she moved through elite spaces without fear and how effortlessly people listened when she spoke. With Zoe, he felt he had finally crossed into the world he had once only imagined from beneath the baobab tree. But love in unequal words often invites concealment. When Zoe asked about his family, Kito described Omar as a quiet village woman, but left out the details that mattered most. He never mentioned the laundry work, the sewed bracelet, the years of hunger. He told himself he was protecting Omar's dignity, but a more troubling truth lived underneath. He did not want his origins to embarrass him in front of people whose approval had become intoxicating. The poorer his real story felt in comparison to the glitter around him, the more carefully he edited it. When news of the relationship reached Kijoni through gossip traveling faster than buses, Omar was thrilled. She prayed for the young woman she had never met. She imagined grandchildren running through the red soil. She began saving tiny coins again, secretly hoping to buy a decent dress if a wedding invitation ever came. She still believed her son's rise would one day circle back to embrace her. She did not see that in the city, Some people already spoke of her as if she were a detail better kept offstage. One market day, Oma used nearly a week's spare money to buy airtime and call Kito herself instead of waiting for him to remember. Her hands trembled as the phone rang through. When he answered, city noise filled the line, car horns, music, voices, movement. Oma's face lit up anyway. She asked if he was eating well, if he was sleeping enough, if the weather in Lamora had turned cold. She told him about the new calf born in the village and the old teacher who still praised him. Her words stumbled out because she had stored them for months. Kito, however, was standing outside an upscale restaurant with Zoe and her friends. He kept glancing at them while Oma spoke. Embarrassment rose in him, not because of her love, but because of how visibly simple that love sounded in a world obsessed with image. He lowered his voice and cut the conversation short. "Mama, I'm in the middle of something important. I'll call you later." She apologized immediately, as if she were the interruption. Of course. I only wanted to hear your voice." He said goodbye quickly and ended the call. Oma stood in the market with the phone still pressed to her ear even after the line went dead. Around her, traders shouted prices and motorcycles rode past, but everything sounded distant. It was not that he had been rude by ordinary standards. It was that she heard, for the first time, the effort in his voice, the effort to move away from her while still sounding respectful. It pierced her more deeply than anger would have. That night she told herself she was imagining it. But mothers know the difference between a busy son and a son who no longer wants his words to touch. When Kito proposed to Zoe, the announcement spread across social circles in Lamore with champagne, photographs, and elegant celebration. Social media filled with images of the couple smiling beneath chandeliers. Oma did not see those posts herself, but a trader's daughter visiting from the city showed the pictures to village girls, and soon the whole story reached Kejoni before Kito's own words did. 3 days later, he finally called. His tone was warm, almost guilty, as he informed Oma of the engagement and promised that of course she would be invited to the wedding. Oma cried with joy during the call, blessing him again and again. Yet once the excitement settled, she noticed what was missing. There had been no prior conversation, no asking for her prayers, no inclusion in the journey. She was being informed of the most important change in her son's life as one informs a relative after arrangements are already complete. Still, she chose gratitude over hurt. She began preparing at once, borrowing sewing patterns, consulting neighbors, and imagining how to present herself with dignity among city people. In Lamora, however, the wedding planning committee led by Zoe's family quietly discussed presentation. Venues, guest lists, luxury decor, business alliances, everything had to reflect class. When the topic of Kito's mother arose, someone asked gently whether it might be less overwhelming if she were brought in only briefly, perhaps seated quietly, perhaps guided carefully. Kito did not openly agree, but neither did he defend her with the force she deserved. He sat in silence, and that silence became the first betrayal large enough to change destiny. Oma spent weeks preparing for the wedding. She borrowed fabric from a church friend and sewed her own dress by hand, a deep blue gown with simple embroidery around the neckline. It was not fashionable by city standards, but it was dignified, clean, and made with pride. She bought cheap shoes that pinched her toes and kept them in a box until the journey day. The village women braided her hair and told her she looked beautiful. Some cried from happiness, saying one of their own was going to witness the success of a son they had watched grow from dust and hunger into greatness. The trip to Lamora was the longest Oma had ever made alone. She carried a small bag, a wrapped wooden carving as a gift for the couple, and a heart full of nervous joy. Every passing mile seemed to confirm that sacrifice had not been in vain. She rehearsed how she would greet Zoe's parents, how she would bless the marriage, how she would sit quietly if required and simply watch her son enter the future she had helped build. In her imagination, Kito would see her and smile with grateful pride. When she arrived in the city, its noise, glass buildings, and speeding traffic overwhelmed her. Yet she straightened her shoulders and followed the address written for her. At the hotel where pre-wedding guests gathered, people in tailored clothing moved like they had never known hunger. Omar stood at the entrance holding her bag, suddenly aware of her accent, her age, her hands hardened by labor. A receptionist stared too long before asking who she was there to see. Omar smiled and said with honest joy, "I am the groom's mother." Inside the hotel lobby, Kito was greeting guests when he turned and saw Omar. For one fragile second, memory crossed his face: childhood roads, letters, lamplight, sacrifice. But just as quickly, he noticed who stood beside him: Zoe's parents, business partners, polished friends, photographers. Something weak and fearful rose in him. Omar, in her handmade dress and worn dignity, did not fit the image of success he had spent years constructing. Instead of rushing toward her as a grateful son should, he hesitated. Omar smiled and lifted her hand, expecting warmth. Kito walked over slowly, kissed her cheek, and said in a voice too formal to be love, "Mama, you should have called before coming into the front area. There are arrangements." The words struck her like cold water. She blinked, unsure whether she had misheard. He lowered his voice further and added, "Please, just sit in the side lounge for now. I'll send someone." It was not shouting. It was worse. It was shame disguised as management. A young attendant led Omar away while guests pretended not to notice. The side lounge was elegant, quiet, and far from the laughter. Omar sat alone with her small bag on her lap, staring at the polished floor. For the first time in all the years of sacrifice, she felt not poor, not tired, not burdened, but unwanted. She remembered every hunger she had hidden from him, every blister, every coin saved. None of it hurt as much as that moment. She had not come asking for wealth or honor. She had come only to stand visibly as his mother. And her son had hidden her like a mistake. As the ceremony approached, the side lounge emptied. No one returned for Omar. She waited, clutching the carved wooden gift until her fingers hurt. From beyond the decorated doors she could hear music, applause, and the muffled rhythm of celebration. Eventually, she stepped into the corridor and asked a passing worker where the wedding hall was. The worker hesitated, then pointed. Omar followed the sound of joy like someone following her own fading place in the world. At the entrance stood security personnel with guest lists. When Omar tried to enter, one of them stopped her politely and asked for her invitation pass. She explained, with a trembling smile, that she was the groom's mother. They exchanged uncertain looks. One man went to check. Minutes passed. Guests streamed around her in shimmering clothing, perfumes, and laughter. Finally, another staff member returned with an embarrassed expression and said there had been seating limitations, and she should wait until after the vows. Omar stood frozen. The hall doors opened briefly, and through the gap she saw Kito at the altar in a perfect suit, smiling beside Zoe beneath flowers and crystal light. He never turned. He never looked for her. Something inside Omar did not break all at once. It collapsed quietly, like a hot beam weakened by years of rain. She stepped back from the doorway, the gift slipping slightly in her hands. In that instant she understood a brutal truth: she had spent a lifetime making sure her son could enter rooms that would not welcome her. And now the room he valued most had become one more place where she did not belong. Omar left the corridor and walked outside into the bright hotel garden, where imported flowers bloomed beside fountains that wasted more water than Kijoni sometimes saw in a week. She sat on a stone bench, still holding the gift, breathing carefully as if pain could be managed like a household task. Around her, laughter spilled from the hall. Somewhere inside, speeches were being made about love, loyalty, and family. The irony was too cruel for tears at first. She simply stared ahead while memories marched through her: Jabulani's last breath, the sold goat, the bracelet, the long road to school, the nights of sewing by lamp. A hotel cleaner noticed her distress and offered water. Omar tried to stand, perhaps to leave before anyone could see her humiliation, but the wall tilted violently. Her chest tightened. The wrapped carving fell from her hands and hit the ground. By the time staff rushed over, she had collapsed beside the bench, her blue dress spreading across the stone path like spilled sow. Guests near the garden screamed. Music from inside faltered as confusion spread. When Kito finally emerged, pushed by alarm and whispers, he found his mother unconscious on the ground. For one terrible moment, all the layers he had built around himself, status, image, ambition, social fear, vanished. What remained was only a son looking at the woman who had carried his entire life on her back. "Mama," he shouted, dropping to his knees. But the word came too late, cracked by panic and guilt. She was carried into an ambulance while wedding guests stared in stunned silence. In that instant, the celebration ended, and truth took the stage. At the hospital, doctors stabilized Omar, but the shock and strain had triggered a serious collapse. While family and guests waited in tense silence, an elderly village teacher who had traveled late to bless the wedding arrived and learned what had happened. Unlike others, he was not afraid of discomfort. Standing before Zoe's parents, Kito's colleagues, and the wedding guests who had gathered in confusion, he spoke with the authority of someone who had known the truth before any of them knew the polished version. He told them everything. He spoke of the morning Omar became a widow, of how she sold her last goat to buy food and school shoes, of the long road to school walked barefoot in places, of her labor in the fields, her night sewing by kerosene flame, her starvation hidden behind lies of fullness, her heirloom bracelet sold for a school trunk and bus fare, and the letters she wrote with untrained hands to keep hope alive. With each sentence, the room changed. What had once been a prestigious wedding gathering became a court of conscience. Zoe stood speechless. Her parents lowered their eyes. Some guests began to cry openly. Kito, hearing his own life retold in the language of sacrifice rather than achievement, felt the full ugliness of what he had become. He had not merely neglected his mother. He had allowed the woman who built him to be humiliated at the very gate of his triumph. No award, no degree, no powerful marriage could survive the moral weight of that revelation unchanged. The thing that had happened after all her sacrifice was now clear to everyone: the son she gave everything for had nearly lost his soul. When Omar finally opened her eyes, the room was dim and quiet except for the soft beeping of machines. Kito was there, seated beside her bed, still wearing pieces of his wedding suit like fragments of a life interrupted. His face looked older, as if one afternoon had done the work of years. The moment he saw her awake, tears filled his eyes without resistance. This was not the controlled sorrow of public apology. It was the raw grief of a son forced to confront the depth of his failure. He fell to his knees beside the bed and pressed his forehead to her hand. Words poured out of him: apologies, confessions, shame, disbelief at himself. He told her he had become a coward in the city, addicted to approval, afraid of being measured by the poverty he came from. He admitted that he had reduced her to a private truth while building a public identity. "You gave me everything," he said, voice breaking. "And I made you feel like nothing. I do not deserve to call myself your son." Omar listened in silence, her face pale but calm. Pain lived in her eyes, yes, but so did something stronger than accusation. After a long time, she touched his head gently and said, "The greatest poverty is not lack of money, Kito. It is forgetting the hands that lifted you." That sentence entered him more deeply than any punishment could have. In it was judgment, mercy, and the last chance to become worthy again. Kito wept harder, not because he had been condemned, but because he had been seen completely. The wedding did not continue that day. The decorations remained, the musicians packed in silence, and the grand reception table stood untouched under expensive flowers. Kito made the decision himself. He publicly addressed the guests and said there could be no celebration built on dishonor. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for understanding. He simply told the truth, that he had failed the woman who had made his life possible, and until he repaired what he could, no ceremony deserved completion. Some people were offended by the scandal. Others respected the honesty. They watched him from across the room with an expression full of disappointment, sorrow, and awakening. For the first time, she saw beyond the polished version of Quito into the one beneath it. She also saw the kind of world her own family had normalized, one where image could quietly outrank humanity. The engagement did not end in anger. It ended in clarity. They both understood that a marriage beginning under the shadow of such moral collapse would not survive unless each first confronted who they had become. News of the halted wedding spread quickly, but Quito no longer tried to manage perception. Shame had already done its work. What mattered now was not whether society judged him harshly, but whether he could rebuild a life rooted in truth. His rise had once been fueled by his mother's sacrifice. His redemption would now require sacrifice of a different kind: ego, vanity, and every false layer he had mistaken for success. After Omar recovered enough to travel, Quito did something no one in Lamora expected. He brought her home to Kejoni and stayed with her there. Not for a day. Not for photographs. For months. He sat again beneath the baobab tree, walked the old road to school, visited his father's grave, and entered the hut where his entire future had once been financed by kerosene fumes, hidden hunger, and relentless labor. The village did not greet him with easy admiration. People were respectful, but they had had enough to know that achievement alone does not make a person honorable. Quito did not resist their silence. He repaired the roof, repainted the school, funded the village well, and restored the teacher's classroom, not as public charity, but as repayment of an old debt to the place that raised him. Most importantly, he stayed near Oma. He cooked for her, accompanied her to church, listened to stories he had once treated as background noise, and watched the lines on her hands with the reverence they deserved. Every ordinary act became a lesson in humility. One evening, as they sat beneath the baobab again, Quito asked softly, "Can a man come back from becoming someone he hates?" Omar looked at the sunset, then at him. "Only if he stops walking away from the truth," she said. It was not instant absolution. Redemption rarely is. But it was a road, and this time, he was willing to walk it with the same patience she had once walked him to school. True to the promise he had made as a child, Quito built Omar a beautiful house in Kejoni, solid walls, a metal roof that did not leak, wide windows, a veranda facing the baobab, and a kitchen stocked with every comfort she had once gone without. He furnished it with respect rather than luxury, placing her old woven mats beside new chairs, keeping the spirit of her life intact. Villagers came to admire it, and many said Omar had finally received what she deserved. But some gifts arrive after the years best suited to enjoy them. Omar was grateful, yet Quito soon understood that a house, however fine, could never repay time, youth, or humiliation. It could not return the bracelet, the goat, the hunger, the loneliness, or the wedding day wound. Seeing her sit quietly on the veranda, wrapped in evening shawls, he realized the deepest truth of all: children often think gratitude can be postponed until they become successful enough to express it grandly. Yet love requires recognition when it is still happening, not only monuments after the damage is done. Amma, however, never measured life the way wounded pride does. She thanked him sincerely and blessed the home. "A good house," she said, touching the wall lightly, "is one where hearts do not hide from each other." Quito carried those words like law. The house became more than shelter. It became a testimony, not to wealth, but to a son learning too late that honor must accompany success, or success rots from within. Years later, after seasons of peace had softened the sharpest edges of pain, Oma passed away quietly in her sleep, in the house her son had built, with village songs rising outside at dawn. This time Quito did not stand distant from grief. He carried it openly. At her funeral, the people of Kejani gathered in numbers so great that the road filled from the church to the baobab tree. Kito stood before them not as a celebrated city success, but as a humbled son. He told the full story of Omar's life without editing a single hardship. He named every sacrifice he could remember. He thanked her not in private shame, but in public truth. After her burial, Kito established the Oman Lovu Foundation, funding education for rural children, especially those raised by widowed or struggling mothers. Every scholarship letter carried a single line: "Do not become too important to remember where your feet first learned to walk." It was the sentence beneath the baobab, now transformed into legacy. In honoring others, Kito finally began honoring her fully. And that is what happened after she sacrificed everything for her son. He rose high, lost his way, broke the heart that built him, and then spent the rest of his life trying to become worthy of her love. Her story did not end in wealth, nor in revenge, nor in perfect restoration. It ended in something rarer: truth passed on as inheritance. Because in the end, the greatest monument to a mother is not the house built in her name. It is the character rebuilt in her memory.